Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we explore the future and what this means for your leadership. We ask the big questions. What's happening on the horizon? What does this mean for us? And most importantly, what skills do I need now for leadership of the future? It's time to explore. Let's go.
Hey there, it's Zoe, your friendly neighborhood Canadian-Australian leadership futurist, and wow, there's cool stuff happening out there on Planet Human a few weeks ago, and I've been thinking about this heaps. Starship, that's SpaceX's monster rocket, and the ship that it wants to fly to the moon and beyond. Starship launched successfully. It made it into the atmosphere and it did a soft landing into the ocean. So it didn't explode as the previous launches had done. So this is its fourth attempt and this is a massive progress for it. Now you might be asking, and so what? I'm not going to space anytime soon. And yet, I think there is a case to think about how the space race, the space economy, space tourism is going to affect our businesses. Here are some of the questions you might consider, even if it feels like your business is miles apart from traveling to space. I would be asking questions like, how might this affect my customer and my customers or clients in terms of their goals, ambitions, and desires? Some of your customers might have the ambition to actually be a space tourist and go on one of the Virgin flights or the Blue Origin flights into space, or even the SpaceX tour around the moon when they get that going. Where does that change? How does that change their priorities, allocation of their resources, and also how they think about their future? So yeah, it may not affect you, but it might affect your customers. And I think this is an excellent tip from the futurist to think about the knock-on effect of these things. And I think the other big part, which is more practical for you, is how might this affect access to resources and the supply chain? Because a massive rocket like this, which was 120 meters high, like that's just massive. It's huge. Just falling into the ocean. It takes a lot of resources to put that together. And at the moment, they're not reclaiming that. So that's just sinking to the bottom of the ocean, which is just terrible. So does that kind of space ambition or the space tourism start to drain resources and supply chain access issues from other parts of businesses? I think that's something that you might want to consider down the track. All right, that's it for Planet Human. On Planet Zoe, this small human, it's my birthday this week. Yep, on the 1st of July, I turned 54. Haha, very exciting. I do not feel 54. I feel still in my 30s. And that's a good thing. I'm actually in really good shape. I'm in much better shape this year than I was last year. Last year, in 2023, I injured my knee and I couldn't move for ages and I put on a lot of weight and I started 2023 with not feeling great. Or actually, I injured my knee in 2022 and all of 23 was pretty terrible. Or was it the other way around? No, that's right. It was a long time anyway. I gained a lot of weight, was terrible, blah. And I've been working on getting my fitness back for 18 months and I feel fabulous. So it is possible to feel fabulous in your midlife. I think that's what they call it now. I'm middle-aged, which sounds like saddlebags, but does not have to be so. Along with the birthday, I've been developing and thinking about my life philosophy and practice. And a lot of this I'm channeling into my upcoming program called Grace Under Fire. And at the moment, we've got information up about the program. We haven't opened the doors. We haven't started selling seats yet, but you can register your interest if you want to get the early bird special pricing. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes. So you can go on and have a look at the program and see if it's right for you. I'm going to be running it in September after ski season, of course. And the idea behind Grace Under Fire, how to exercise power without losing your soul, is we look at the very personal application of power in a leadership context and how the way that you express power is serving you and not serving you. And we look at that from an individual as well as systemic point of view. From the individual point of view, I want you to feel seen, heard, and valued. I want you to have your power and get promoted. I was about to say, have your power and eat it too. Have your power and get promoted. You'll get visible, develop your voice, and expand your vision. So I'm pretty pumped about this program. We will be running it in September. It will be a virtual program with access individually to me for some individual coaching. So, and that will feed into the power book that I'm writing also, currently researching, tentatively called Power Games. Woohoo! Okay, that's enough about Planet Zozo. Who is our guest today, and what is my question for you is what you want to know. My question for you is, what are you responsible for when it comes to mental health in the workplace? And you will be surprised. There are many things that you as a leader are responsible for when it comes to mental health in the workplace, and what is the individual responsible for. My guest today is a repeat customer, Mark Butler, and he's just lovely. He's a lovely Irishman. I just love talking with him. He is a mental health expert and author of Up Yours, The Pursuit of Radical Self-Care. That's his latest book. And he works with organizations and teams to refine their approach to mental health in the workplace. And we have an excellent conversation about the trends and government regulations that are coming onto your doorstep and what you need to do about them. So, on with the show. All the way from Byron Bay. Yes, just let's pause and think about the joy of Byron Bay. Beautiful beaches, sunshine, and a peaceful demeanor. That is Byron Bay, and welcome to the show, repeat customer Mark Butler.
Thank you very much, Zoe. Lovely to be here and very excited to have a conversation with you again.
Thank you. Well, 4 years on since the start of the pandemic. And when we last caught up, we were kind of in the throes of it. And burnout was all the big topic because everybody was struggling to cope with everything. What has changed, if anything, since the end quotation mark of the pandemic when it comes to self-care?
Wow, big question. What has changed? I think a much greater awareness of the sort of challenges and the mental health challenges people face. Here in Australia, we're seeing the introduction of a number of elements of legislation that is going to shift how we work and how we look after our people.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. So the Work Health and Safety Act, the international standard, ISO 45001, if you follow these things, talks about work health and safety. And in essence, it speaks to how everybody has the right to go home after work. There's a sort of a subsection of that now, which is known as ISO 45003, which talks about psychosocial hazards that we face in the workplace. Now, I'm not a fan of the phrase psychosocial hazards. It kind of feels like I should be wearing a lab coat, and it might not click for a lot of people. In fact, very early on in this piece, when I used to speak about it with organizations that didn't know what I was talking about, or the ones that did, kind of felt it didn't really reflect them because it had the word psycho in it, and I thought, that's not really us. Bottom line is, here in Australia, if you have an ABN, an Australian business number, then the legislation refers directly to you. And what it talks about is we need to be in a prevention mindset now. So the legislation says that we have to identify those mental health challenges in the workplace that could affect our people. So, and identifying them means having a conversation with everyone in the organization. We can't just sort of throw stones and sort of hope that we hit a few of them. The legislation requires us to collaborate with everybody. And then we have to assess those hazards and identify where the risks are. Following that, then we have to put in measures in place that show that we are dealing with them. But here's the interesting part. We have to be dealing with them from a prevention space. So we'll probably talk about burnout a little bit later on in our conversation and the interesting idea about how do we prevent it rather than how do we measure it and then mitigate it. So it's a total game changer here in Australia. There's other legislation around providing time off for people experiencing family and domestic violence or coercive control. There's very new pending, if it's not already, legislation. We're talking around the right to disconnect. That's going to be an interesting place to play, particularly for organizations that have international offices, a head office in the US, where the expectation is you're here for the meeting. We're having a meeting in New York and you need to be in on it. well, hang on a minute, I have to get out of bed to do that. So, at what point is this, do we have a right to disconnect from the work we're doing? So there's lots of stuff going on. Now, ISO 45003, the psychosocial hazards legislation, we have introduced in Australia in response to that new international standard. But the international standard is still just a guide. It will become law, and I suspect sooner rather than later, because I think the time has come. We now have to prioritize mental health in the workplace, because it is one of the first places where we can actually be in a prevention space. Because when we're talking about the health sector here, we spend exactly 1.34% of the health budget is spent on prevention, which is low. It's a half to a third of what comparable countries are spending, like the US and the UK, Canada, and New Zealand. Yeah, we're way behind. But then we are spending 3 times as much as the global average on treatment of mental health, at about 7.5% of our budget, which is still well short of the 14 to 20% disability life years lost as a result of mental health. And, depending on how you measure that. But no matter what way you look at it, it falls well short of what's required. But we're still doing better than most countries. So we're not great at preventing, but we're much better than most at tackling. And we're still far behind where we could be in tackling mental health in society. So I think it comes down to the workplace. What can the workplace do to recognize issues that are causing mental health challenges to our people? And the legislation lists off a whole load, and it's all to do with job demand, workload. I'm finding work clarity, expectation, or the weight of expectation on our people seems to be every bit as big as too much work. So we've almost normalized trying to do more with less now, even though that is in contradiction with the legislation. But we've had head freeze counts. We've had an inability to source the best people for a role. So we've been doing more with less. And that has an effect, and an undesirable effect. So the legislation is there to try and counteract that. There's other areas they've highlighted, like discrimination and bullying, etc. So every organization now should have a very solid measure of what those challenges are for their people. Not mental health in the workplace. That's because people, 1 in 4 of us will experience some mental health challenge, and it's not all work related. It's not all workplace related. But still, there's stuff that can be happening at work that can affect our mental health, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does make a lot of sense. And my brain is leaping to the massive culture change that needs to occur for a lot of organizations that are still deploying old models of let's work everybody to the bone. And even though I had this exact conversation with somebody yesterday, and she said the message from the CEO was, okay, don't send emails after work. If you're going to, because we know you're senior managers and you're going to work extra hours, don't tell the people that you manage that you are working extra hours, and schedule those emails so they go within work hours. So the idea is pretend to model good work practices, but don't actually, because we need you still to deliver those extra hours for which you won't get paid. So that's mixed messages and double standard, and still contributing to the issues.
Yeah, totally. We see that a lot. And in actual fact, in France now, it is organizations are getting fined huge sums of money for sending emails outside of hours. And I think their hours are 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Anything outside of that, an organization can cop a considerable fine for sending emails to people. I'm still not sure what the legislation here is yet, whether senior execs or people on salaries as opposed to wages. People on award wages may be protected, but people in a salaried position may not be covered. I'm not really sure where it's going to extend to just yet, but it'll be interesting to see. But look, it's a hugely important factor, particularly if we're going to be compliant with this, what the legislation now says we must be preventing work-related mental health challenges. And we have to, first of all, identify what they are. And they're not always obvious. It's not too much work necessarily. It can be, I'm finding a lot of the time, it's frustration. So there's 6 of us in the team. There used to be 9 or 10. And so we're all doing 1.5 jobs, just trying to keep the thing afloat. But I don't know what the priority is anymore. And anytime I ask my boss, he or she bites my head off. So I'm not going to ask them again. So I'm just going to flounder until A, I get into trouble, or B, I quit, one of the two. And then because leaders are already frustrated and overwhelmed, the only feedback I'm getting is some kind of a finger wag at me when I get something wrong. So that feels like bullying to me. And so, I'll be laying a claim of bullying against my leader, who is already stressed and strung out anyway. So it's very often that frustration. I don't know what's expected of me anymore because I don't know what the priority is.
So frustration leads to disgruntlement, leads to lots of bad things. And one of the bad things that I could learn to is burnout. And I think in our last interview, we talked a bit about burnout. I think it's worth defining it once again for listeners as the first part of the question, and then to move to the second part, which is who is actually responsible for burnout, the worker or the workplace? Okay, so what is it and who's responsible?
Okay, great. 2 great questions, or 1 great question in 2 parts. Look, burnout, the World Health Organization has their definition. Maslach Inventory has another one. Essentially, what's going on is it is said that burnout is occurring for people when there are 3 sort of recognized domains relating to burnout. And the first one is exhaustion, which I think we can all agree. And that could be mental, physical, or emotional exhaustion. And an insider tip for your listeners here is it's almost always emotional exhaustion. We can overcome physical and mental by taking a break. Emotional exhaustion has much deeper sort of roots to it, if you like. The second element of the traditional model talks about efficacy. Again, a lab coat word, and it's sort of quite an academic word. But basically what it talks about is our ability to do our best work. And the most passionate person, when they're feeling overwhelmed, can actually not manage to do their best work. Anyone who's had COVID knows what the COVID brain is like now. It's that sort of brain fog, and it's hard to concentrate and we can't remember things. This is very common for people who are experiencing burnout. And then the third element, which traditionally is seen as the third sort of cause of burnout, is what they call cynicism. So that's that sort of disconnected mental jadedness that we get as a result of feeling the overwhelm that we're feeling. But to my mind, from a psychology background, to me, the cynicism is actually more of a symptom than it is a cause. It's an outcome, if you like. And how it manifests in the workplace is gossip. So when your people and your teams are gossiping and they're bad-mouthing the organization or the workload or the leader or the culture of the organization, or they might be bad-mouthing and denigrating the customers, which is the worst-case scenario. What's happening there is I see that as a sort of a coping behavior. And I see that as, okay, I'm experiencing this level of overwhelm and I'm a bit embarrassed about it. And I'm afraid, I can't keep up and I'm trying my best and it's just not enough. And so I need to find out. Misery loves company, right? So I'm going to try and find out if there's somebody else in my team who's experiencing the same thing. So I start gossiping and I see, I throw out a few leads and see who bites. And so what I'm doing there is I'm first of all validating what I'm feeling. I can't possibly be the only other person feeling like that. And secondly, I'm trying to recruit other people into that space because it's a lonely place to be. And so to me, cynicism externalizes what's going on there. Generally speaking, when I'm gossiping or when I'm cynical, I'm kind of not taking responsibility or ownership for what I'm experiencing or feeling in myself. And that was my recognition through years of working with people in recovery from addiction. If someone in early recovery relapses, and everybody does, it's a part of the process. But when they would tell you that they'd relapsed, they would give you 10 different excuses as to why it happened to them, what made them drink or what made them pick up. And generally speaking, they're looking for things outside of themselves that they can blame for it. And I think the same thing happens when we're overwhelmed and we're feeling burnt out. So we start to look for all the other things it can be rather than I need to sort of take sort of more care of myself. And so to my mind, burnout, cynicism is one description. I think apathy is probably a better description for it. in the sense that it's, okay, I've reached the end of the line. I can't do anymore. I've had enough, sort of thing. That's the sort of breakdown point, if you like, which is a bit more descriptive than cynical. But even in those three elements of burnout, there's no mention of mental ill health here anywhere. And so I think that we need to have a conversation around the sort of mental anguish that people are feeling as a result of feeling overwhelmed and burnt out. That is missing from the conversation up until now. Now, also, Professor Gordon Parker here at University of New South Wales wrote a very good book a couple of years ago now about burnout, beating burnout. And I think his model has about 12 different elements to it, which I think too many, for most of us to sort of grasp. And so, I talk about this fourth one, and that is the mental health of our people who are experiencing burnout. So that's kind of what it looks like. And the second part of your question is who's responsible for it? That's a bit of a tricky one. Jennifer Moss, in a Harvard Business Review article, and I think her book a few years ago, said work-related burnout is an organizational problem, not a person problem. And I think she's right when she's talking about things like workload or job design or job satisfaction, etc. That is pretty much work related. But I think also we need to recognize that not all burnout is work related. That can be dealing with special needs parents, special needs children. It can be taking on too much work. It can be, taking on too much outside of the workplace. It can be some personality sort of types are more susceptible to it. The sort of neurotic or the introverted sort of people can experience burnout a lot sooner than some of the rest of us can. So when we're talking about those other areas where burnout can actually occur, using the sort of elements I just described, that can be something that's outside of work. But still, the workload that we then have is certainly not going to help it, and it can actually exacerbate the levels of burnout. So that's why the legislation talks about work-related burnout, if you like. So, it's kind of both of our responsibilities. I mean, we also, as employees of an organization, have a responsibility, and it's kind of part of our contract that we present at work in the best state possible to fulfill our duties. That's a requirement of us. So in that sense, burnout can be the responsibility of the individual as well. I heard let me just share this one with you, a great sort of definition of burnout. I was in a conversation with some people and we were talking about emotional intelligence, and the conversation or the idea came up, of course, that burnout, if you kind of peel back any descriptions or elements of it, it's actually suppressing our emotional response to what's happening for us. So I'm feeling exhausted, but I push through. I'm feeling emotionally exhausted, but I ignore it and I put on a big bright smiley face and I keep charging through. I feel like I'm trying my best, but my best work just isn't good enough. So I'm feeling overwhelmed and I'm feeling shame and I'm feeling some sort of discomfort, but I push through. The cynicism or apathy thing is I feel like I've reached the end of the line, but I keep pushing through. So all of the emotional signs and indicators that I've noticed this has crept up on me, I've pushed aside or I've pushed down or I've pushed away, and I've suppressed the emotional response that I really need to recognize in the pursuit of trying to be okay with my burnout and trying to overcome it. And that's a natural thing to do, I think. But, at its core, it is denying the emotional response we have to the overwhelm that we're feeling.
So as a preventative measure, is it teaching people how to deal with negative emotions as they come up instead of trying to bury them and lead down the burnout track? So that could be a preventative strategy.
I think so. And I think the conversation around emotional intelligence has grown in recent years through Daniel Goleman and Travis Bradbury and Jean Greaves and Amy Edmondson and people like that, some really good luminaries. Simon Sinek talks about it a lot. Adam Grant talks about emotional intelligence. So it is very much in the lexicon, and it's a highly valued skill for leaders. But very often it's about how they recognize it in other people. And I think, charity begins at home. We have to sort of learn to recognize it in ourselves first and not to deny it when we see it. There's a sort of what I'm about to say, Zoe, is true until it's not, right? Behind I say every conscious decision or action or behavior, because there are things we do that are outside of our consciousness, habits as an example, there are actions that we take without thinking about them, that we're not aware of them, or indeed survival stuff like blinking, breathing and body temperature, there's no action taken there. But any conscious decision or conscious behavior that we undertake, it's underpinned, or it's a result of an emotional felt sense that we've got. There's some kind of an emotion or a feeling arising that causes the action to occur. This is my opinion. And behind every one of those felt senses or emotions, there is some kind of a yearning or a desire or a need or a want that we have, either from ourselves or from our environment. A kind of a simplified metaphor of that, I think, would be, I'm dehydrated, so I need to take on some water. So I will feel thirsty. I feel thirsty. Oh, that tells me I need to go get a drink. So the need causes an emotion or a feeling, which causes an action to occur. And that's pretty much across everything we do. And when we're aware of that, then I think it changes this idea. Some people will say, oh, I'm not really an emotional person, or I don't get emotional and I don't feel emotions. We're feeling emotion or several emotions 24/7, every minute of the day. Even when we're asleep, we're experiencing them. So to say that they're not important is wildly, I shouldn't say untruthful, but it's wide of the mark, very wide of the mark. They are a signal and they're a message that we have a need of some kind that needs to be met. And when you look at them like that, then they're not good or bad. They just are. They're just messages. And so if we're burned out, we've been suppressing our need and our desire and our want and our yearning for such a long time that the body is going to, if we don't look after our bodies, then it'll look after itself, without
it gives you some even stronger signals generally.
Absolutely.
In the form of illness or collapse.
Yeah, exactly right. The body will decide, and we won't have as much of a say in it. And that's what's occurring.
Building on some of our conversation around burnout and emotions, etc., there's this there's not a leading thing. There's interesting conversations happening in the leadership space, in the counseling space, about trauma-informed counseling and trauma-informed leadership. And I'm wondering how that links back to emotional intelligence issues. Well, first of all, what is trauma-informed counseling or leadership or management? And what does that mean for us when it comes to preventative measures in the workplace?
Yeah. Look, my background is trauma-informed care, right? So clinical psychotherapist and clinical director, and I've worked with populations experiencing trauma for a great number of years. So it's kind of become second language to me, and sometimes I don't recognize whether I'm in that trauma-informed care or not, but I think I always am. And to me, trauma-informed leadership is an approach, I think, where leaders and those who lead integrate an understanding of trauma and its effects into our management style and our interactions with our people. It's not about recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma, but sort of creating a supportive work environment that considers the complexities of people's kind of experiences, if that makes sense. So it's about sort of creating safety and trustworthiness. So anyone who does, and look, we all have experienced trauma of some shape or form. And we talk about post-traumatic stress, but what doesn't get spoken about is post-traumatic growth, which is, it doesn't get spoken about because it doesn't need addressing, because it's kind of fortified us to some extent. So if you're a trauma-informed leader, then you are very acutely aware of how to make people feel safe and sort of how to feel like they can trust you and the team and the environment and the organization. So it's about empathy and compassion. And we could talk about those a little bit as well in a minute, but it's about sort of empowering people. And even if, I work in the space around mental health in the workplace, And when I'm training and working with leaders all the time, I tell them, you never tell someone what to do to get better. You empower them in making their own decisions. You know, this give a person a fish, feed them for a day sort of an idea. And generally speaking, as a leader, if we're going to tell somebody what to do to get better, the odds are what we're going to tell them to do is either going to feel like minimizing or discrediting or trying to sort of brush away what their experience actually is. And even though we're well-meaning, whatever we suggest, they've probably already tried if we've noticed that they're struggling, you know. So it's a question of about empowering them to seek what support they need. And we just ask them, what can we do to help and support? And we give choice, you know, this or that, yes or no. They're not choices, they're just decisions. Choices are, is it 1, 2, or 3? And sometimes the choice might be do nothing. If we can't think of anything else we can do. Well, we could do nothing, or we could do this, or have you thought about that? And empower them in the sort of, give them autonomy in their sort of recovery, if you like, which then feels collaborative and it feels safe and it feels more trustworthy. And it also shows that the leader is vulnerable enough to say, I don't have all the answers, but we'll do what we need to together to help you through this, and particularly if it's a work-related issue.
If it's a work-related one, what if it's not? And I'm curious about your stance on this, Mark. And you started the conversation with talking about WH&S, psychosocial hazards in the workplace, and the question of who's responsible, the worker or the workplace, and the notion that the worker is responsible for showing up the best version of themselves. And yet it seems to me that this trauma-informed leadership kind of puts more of the responsibility for preventing burnout back onto the workplace. Particularly is if we go with the assumption that people are experiencing trauma in their personal worlds and we're there to assist them resolving it somehow by offering them, helping them find the way forward. Do you find that there's a bit more of a weight now on the organization to carry a little bit of that responsibility for the workers' personal worlds as a mental health practice?
Yeah, look, I don't think so. I think it's a nice to have if it's work-related trauma, and there is quite a bit of that, by the way, then absolutely the organization needs to be across it. In fact, I would suggest that we've painted everything as burnout in the last few years, and sometimes it might not be. So by that I'm saying, you know, burnout's kind of become a ubiquitous term, isn't it? And so it's become the catch-all for a myriad of workplace stressors and sort of mental fatigue, if you like. I'm talking about the experience, and the experiences that a great number of sectors find. And when we don't have the right language, we just call it burnout. But when we treat everything as burnout, we're going to get it wrong. I'm talking about things like vicarious trauma, which is very prevalent in emergency service workers, health and education. Compassion fatigue, again, very much we're used to it being sort of health and sort of fire and rescue, etc., an issue for them. But secondary traumatic stress, moral injury, there's a whole host of different mental health challenges that are workplace related or can be workplace related. But it's not just first responders and emergency service workers and healthcare workers. Human resources, nobody's worked as hard as people in human resources feels in the last 4 or 5 years. And yet they kind of hold themselves to a different standard, and I berate them all the time for doing that. You know, courts and justice experience huge elements of, you know, highly emotional and traumatized people. The legal fraternity, every client they have is highly emotionally charged and feeling wrong done by, sort of thing. Local government, is it something like 70% of local government areas have experienced some kind of catastrophe in the last few years? So that's all of the people that work. Customer service staff, insurance, loss adjusters and insurance companies. It used to be, and now I'm being sort of not flippant, but, you know, it used to be, I've crashed my car and I need to get it repaired, please, was the phone call. But now it's, I've lost everything. You know, I've lost my home and all of our possessions. And you know, that's a highly emotional situation. It happened to me, so I know it. So in short, NDIS, journalism in recent times, as you can imagine, very badly affected. NDIS workers, even tech support people, anyone who's on the sort of receiving end of a customer service phone call is copping, highly emotionally charged people who are afraid and at the end of their life, which creates a whole host of mental health challenges. But if we call them burnout, we're going to get it wrong. How you deal with one is not how you would deal with the other. And then you even speak to people like teachers or nursing and medical staff. And I could say, I need 2 hours with your team to work through some of this. And they'd laugh and they'd say, you can have 5 minutes. You know what I mean? And that in itself is a reason to give me 2 hours, you know? So it's tackling and treating those sorts of issues, and particularly when we misdiagnose them, is a real challenge. And there, as I say, a great number of those sort of sectors and industries that are experiencing things that feel and look and smell a little bit like burnout, but they're actually not.
One last question before we go to the Fast Five. Can you give me an example of moral injury?
Yeah. I'm going to go out on a limb and say people who used to work in big tobacco used to talk about that sometimes. Online gambling, I've heard, I've spoken to people who've experienced working in that space. That what they're doing is they're having to do a role that sort of interferes with their own sense of what's right and wrong. The extreme version is veterans, ex-military, having to do things that feel morally reprehensible, but they're under an obligation or a duty to do it. That might reflect in local government area where I'm ostensibly a greenie kind of climate aware person, but now I have to knock down this edge of a forest because we're putting in a housing estate or an industrial estate. So that flies in the face of what I believe to be right, but I kind of have to do it for my job anyway. So that's moral distress or moral injury. It can happen in the healthcare sector. Sometimes we have to make financial type decisions that are not, they don't serve everybody, but difficult decisions have to be made. Veterinarians, 4 times the suicide rate of any other occupation.
Really?
Yeah. And people think vets are loaded, very wealthy. They're actually not. They get compared with the health sector. And people say, God, to care for my dog costs thousands of dollars. Well, the health sector is subsidized and animal care isn't. So what you're actually paying is not going into the pockets of a vet. Veterinarians are not massively well paid. People maybe who own practices might be, but a veterinarian, you don't get into it for the money. You get into it for the love of caring for animals or this kind of compassion that you have. And so you'll develop compassion fatigue because there seems to be I've heard it in conversations with vets, there's a $3,000 sort of magic limit that when the cost of caring for a pet, like a dog or something, exceeds $3,000, they say, just put them down. And then the vet has to go, but for $3,000, you can save their life. I don't have it. So the vet then has to play life and death, and I've spoken to vets who say, I have to do that 4 times a day. That has an effect, particularly if you've gone into that career because of your love for animals. That's a really difficult thing to do. So they experience that moral injury quite a lot. It's very, very difficult.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that.
Sure.
Are you ready for the Fast Five?
Oh, yes. I'll do my best.
Number 1, what is the future technology you most want right now?
Look, I'm not a very techie person, so and everything gets branded with AI at the moment. But if I wanted to try and think of something, it'll bring us back to earlier in the conversation. If we had some kind of a wearable device or some kind of an app that could in real time measure our mood, our emotional response and our stress response to where we're at in real time, not after the event, I think that could be a hugely valuable piece of technology that could support and save so many of us.
Well, we're kind of not far off. I'm looking at the 2 pieces of wearable tech I have right now. So I got my watch, my Garmin, which actually gives me feedback on my pulse, heart rate variability and activities, as does my Ring. And you can click to tell me how I'm stressed am right now, and it'll tell you very stressed or not stressed, but it doesn't give you an emotional gauge, I guess.
Probably, yeah. And the emotional gauge is going to be the earlier one, isn't it? Like heart rate variability is a brilliant measure of stress. And I have an Apple Watch for, We should get sponsored for this. But I have an Apple Watch and I have an app that tells me when I am sort of stressed, etc. But sometimes it can be quite wrong. It'll tell me I'm at 94% stress with 16% energy levels, and I'm sitting watching TV after dinner. So, it's not necessarily right. But again, and then the heart rate variability measures are a report after the event. So look, you're right. We're not far off. We will get there, I think. It's getting closer.
Okay. Number 2, what is the best tip you ever got for leadership?
Prioritize empathy or emotional intelligence. I think that was the one. And again, empathy is a double-edged sword. It's not always appropriate. And sometimes it gets confused with sympathy, but it's very tribal. So I'm going to care much more about my team than I'm going to care about your team, Zoe. Or I'm going to care about the people that are beside me in the office every day versus the ones that are working remotely or interstate, etc. So empathy, as important as it is, treat it carefully. But I think without it, we're back to the old industrial revolution. Somebody gets killed on the job, just replace them, Leave your troubles at home, you're here to work. Those days are gone,
Okay. Number 3. What's one problem in the workplace you'd love to wave a magic wand and be fixed right now?
Oh, I think it would work in the workplace and society if we continue to reduce the stigma, whether real or imagined, stigma and sort of shame people feel around their mental health and mental well-being. If we could eliminate that, I may well be out of work and I'd be very happily walk away if I thought that wasn't needed. So I think that sort of, reduce stigma or eliminate it would be even better.
Awesome. Thumbs up or thumbs down? Who's the leader you want to give a thumbs up to, or a leader you want to give a thumbs down to?
Because of my clinical background, I don't name names. I very rarely tell people who I'm working with. And it's probably unnecessary, but it's just inbuilt into me to not have conversations about stuff like that. But I would say any leader who is vulnerable enough to put themselves in a situation where they're having conversations that they felt might be uncomfortable or that they're unsure of, if you've got the courage to do that, I'm in your corner. I'm team leader for that one. Yeah. And I think that's becoming more and more necessary now with the new legislation. So,
okay. All right. Number 5, favorite leadership book or podcast aside from the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast?
Well, it's hard to pick one besides that. If you're taking that off the list, then my second favorite. There's a book I've been reading. You're going to catch me on the name now. Owen Eastwood wrote a book called Belonging. And I think the tagline is something like the ancient philosophy of togetherness or the ancient practice of togetherness, something like that. It's an incredibly informative book. I really, really enjoyed it. It's speaking to culture, and he uses a lot of sort of sporting teams and the culture within teams for how they perform together, but also how they portray themselves externally. Great conversations in there around evolution and how we've evolved as tribes, and that's been our sort of saving grace, if you like, the difference between what separates us from the other mammals, if you like. I love that book, and I'm on my second way around it now, because you always spot something the second time around.
Wow. Okay, cool. I love books that people read twice, so that's a huge testimony that it's good. Fantastic. Well, that was the Fast 5. Well done.
It could have been faster. I yammer a lot. Sorry.
Well, you survived, and I chipped in too. So there you go. The Fast-ish 5 is what I should probably call that section.
Yeah, for me anyway. Yeah.
The Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast is proudly sponsored by the Amplifiers Academy. It is an online self-paced leadership development program that you can join at any time and progress at your pace. There are very short video lessons, great checklists and resources and recommendations and book summaries, all there to help boost your leadership thinking and abilities. We focus on leading strategy, leading culture, leading change, and leading performance. So if you want a go-to resource that can help boost your strategic abilities immediately, check us out, Amplifiers Academy, on the ZoeRouth.com website. See you there. So, Mark, looking at the questions that we haven't touched yet, what is the one question that I haven't asked yet that you'd love to answer?
We were going to talk about the model in my book, in Up Yours, the look in, look up, look out model. I suppose if we were to sort of dive into that, it would have been, we need to look at our self-care from a radical perspective. By that, I mean from a sort of fundamental ground up, re-look at what self-care looks like. We tend to pick one or two things we're going to focus on. And, I'm going to watch what I eat, and I'm going to slow down drinking, and then I'm going to get more exercise. But there is so much more to our self-care than that. And my model, when I talk about sort of looking up, what I mean is stop for a minute, smell the roses, check in on how you're treating yourself. So I say self-care is more than sleep, diet, and exercise, but it's also the first place, the most fundamental place you got to look. And so there's long conversations to be had about each of those areas and how we can improve them. I never tell people to eat their fruit and veggies. We know that stuff already, right? You don't need me to tell you. But we do, in the book, we do talk about why we're doing it and about getting our daily dose of, our dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins, all of the brain chemicals we need for stability and mood control. When I talk about looking in, I'm talking about brain health. It's an organ like every other organ in the body, but we don't kind of think of it. We don't think of other organs. I mean, our lungs are lunging and our livers are livering, and we tend not to pay them much attention. But there's stuff that we do that we know is going to harm them or improve them. And it's the exact same with our brain. And so I talk about the variety of things we can do to support that, which then become all-encompassing support. Meditation, mindfulness, playtime, hugely important, and the first thing to go when we're burnt out. So finding that spontaneous fun and joy in our day that has no consequence beyond it making us feel good about ourselves. The dance like nobody's watching kind of an idea, right? Mm. Then when I talk about looking out, what I'm talking about is relationships and connection, belonging, and boundaries, which is becoming a bit of a heavily flogged word in recent times. And people seem to think boundaries are, I'm going to tell you how to behave in front of me, which is completely the wrong sort of approach. A boundary is how you're going to behave yourself. How other people behave is up to them if they want to respect your boundary or not. What are you going to do about it if they don't? So it's a bit like our workplace has terms and conditions for us working there. Starting time, finishing time, sometimes. How much holidays you get, what salary you get in return for the work you do, etc. So those are kind of terms and conditions. They're not boundaries. But I say to people, what are your terms and conditions for yourself? Is one of the terms and conditions of you working there that you are going to switch off at 8 p.m., that you do have family meals, or that you don't miss your children's piano recitals, or that you get your exercise every day? People call these non-negotiables. I don't think anything is non-negotiable. That's a barrier that just breaks down relationship. But your terms and conditions tell you how you're going to behave and how what's okay for you and what's not. It's not for anybody else. It's for you. And so that's what your boundary is as well. And we base them on our values, not our emotions at the time. So it's either a value I have around punctuality, a value I have around respect people have for me. It could be a value I have around getting the exercise I need because I know it's good for my mental health. So my boundary, my terms and conditions for myself and how I'm going to behave in each of those spaces, which is a bit different from I'm going to tell you how to behave in front of me.
Yeah. My understanding of boundaries, and I've looked at boundaries for 20 years, is elements of that, how I am pledging to myself that I'm going to show up, and also where I intersect with you, how we can do that. So what agreements I want to make with you. So, for example, my agreement is I will show up on time. And if you're going to work with me, I expect you to show up on time as well. That could be a boundary negotiation. That's a way that I...
It could be, yeah, yeah.
So it's sort of like that crossover. And also when I think about boundaries in intimate relationships, it's not acceptable for you to hit me physically or to insult me. That could be another pushback boundary, if you like. So that's what I include in boundaries. Is that what you include in boundaries too, or not?
Yes, it is. So I will not tolerate being physically or emotionally abused. No, I can say to you, you're not to do that to me. But what I'm saying to you is I will not tolerate it. So if you do that to me, there will be consequences, and it'll probably be me taking myself away to safety, or police are involved, or whatever it is. So what I'm saying to the other person is, this is my line. This is my picket fence. And what happens inside my picket fence, which is a boundary between neighbors, is in my control and my domain. And if somebody transgresses it, then I will take steps to look after myself. I'm not going to tell you you're not to climb my fence. I'm just saying to you that this is my fence and this is my space, and I protect it fiercely. Now it's up to you to join the dots and go, okay, then I better not climb over Mark's fence. Or if I am going to, I'm going to ask permission first. You know, there's a negotiation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I know. So, I'm just thinking about, I want to spank you. Do I have permission to? Was where my brain went to with that one.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I don't tolerate being spanked. Different to say, don't you dare spank me. That's a kind of this is my language and this is my tolerance level and my line. You can't take that from me. But if I tell you how to behave in front of me, you don't have to pay any attention to that.
I love that phraseology. I don't tolerate.
Yeah.
So you're right. It puts a choice back on the other person as opposed to do not do this.
Yeah. So again, it's like empowering them. You have a choice to make as to how you behave with me or to me. But I have declared what's okay for me and what's not. Now you have a choice as to whether you want to honor that or not. And if you do honor it, well, then we're going to have a really good relationship. But we also know each other's limits. And there is nothing more satisfying than knowing where you stand with somebody. You know, which is why I also say we never set our boundaries on our emotional response. If I'm in a good mood, you can treat me any way you like, but if I'm in a bad mood, you better not. I've got no idea of knowing what your mood is going to be like, so I don't know where your boundary is. But if it's, I do not tolerate being called, being abused or being called some kind of an abusive term or name or something, then you know not to call me that.
Right. Awesome. Mark, this has been really fantastic. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and it's been enlightening about the new movements and responsibilities in the workplace, and leaders have yet more tall orders in order to create safety in the workplace and a more productive work environment, which we should be doing anyway. So
it leads to deeper engagement and keeping the people that matter to us. It's like in a relationship. If we look after the people around us, they're going to stay. If we don't, someone else will look after them.
Yeah, and keep the good ones. Mark, thank you. You're one of the good ones. I appreciate you coming on the show and your fabulous Irish accent and all your wisdom to come with it.
Thank you very much, Zoe. I really appreciated the opportunity.
Well, it was a pleasure to speak with Mark again. He has so much knowledge and depth of experience, and there was so much to talk about. A couple of takeaways for me. One was the post-traumatic growth concept. So not all trauma leads to disaster. Some trauma can lead to growth and expansion. I think that's useful to remember. So I'll take that and tuck it away in the corner of my brain to dwell on a little bit more. And the exploration of psychosocial hazards and the need for prevention in the workplace was an eye-opener for me too. And it comes back to, as I alluded to in our conversation, that organizations really have to pay attention to their systems and their culture. So that is creating a lot of dramas and issues for people in the workplace. And that's the kind of change leadership that we need right now when it comes to contending with psychosocial hazards and being preventative. In terms of the tip of the week, it'll come from my fourth book, People Stuff Beyond Personality Problems, an advanced handbook for leadership. And a couple of things I talk about in this book are about developing the skills of being real. So let me read a little bit about this. This is page 142. And Mark spoke a little bit about this, how we lack emotional intelligence. So here we go. As a society, we have not yet included deep emotional competence as a critical social skill to be taught and nurtured. Most of us are not taught how to feel our feelings fully in a useful and constructive way. We are told to bury them, to pull our socks up and soldier on. The alternative to steely reserve and its counterpoint of messy emotions is to be real rather than raw. Being raw is about being an open book, completely transparent in all of our jiggling messiness. It's compelling, kind of like watching open heart surgery. Fascinating and revolting at the same time. Being real, though, is the ability to experience one's emotions fully, to have emotions and not be them. It's about being open, but not so much that we ooze and gush over others. Being real is more like an X-ray than surgery. You can see everything that is going on without getting dirty. Learning to experience and express feelings without being carried away by them is a missing critical leadership skill, the skill of being real. So how do we develop the skills of being real in ourselves and others? There's 3 areas to focus on. One is the body focus, and that's simply learning how to bring your awareness to the sensations in your body, as Mark spoke about. They are signals. It's useful to figure out that we're having them and to pay attention to them for information. The second one is brain focus. So what can we do to change the way that we focus and translate about what's going on? Meditation and mindfulness, as Mark mentioned, are key methods for that. And the third area of focus is language focus. How we translate and interpret what's going on, the language that we use to make sense of what's happened. All right, so that's my tip of the week from People Stuff. And you can read People Stuff for free. I have the free ebook version up on my website. If you go to blog, you can opt in to get my monthly roundup, which includes, as a bonus, the free ebook version of People Stuff. Okay, so coming up next on the show, we have Louise Mowbray, and she's written a fantastic book called Relevant, and it's basically all the tools and tips you need to be a meta-modern leader, and we have a deep, profound conversation. Okay, what else? If you like the show, please tell me. Email me, zoe@zoerouth.com. Rate or review the show, post something about it, share the episode with someone who might benefit from it, and basically be a cheerleader. That would be fantastic. I love hearing from listeners. It makes this way more of a conversation and rewarding for me. In the meantime, I hope that you live with grace and lead in service. And that means live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast. To find out more about leadership of the future or to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.